Everyone thinks the UFC is unstoppable. They sell out arenas, they dominate social media, they've basically turned fighting into a global entertainment machine. But the numbers are starting to say something very different. Because while fans argue about rankings and champions, and who deserves the next title shot, the UFC is quietly losing ground where it matters most. Not in 2035, not one day, in 2026. And once you see what's happening behind the scenes, you'll realize why the UFC's biggest advantage is turning into its biggest weakness. If you want to understand what's really happening to the UFC, you don't start with pay-per-view numbers. You start with a feud. Because for years now, Dana White and Ariel Helwani haven't just disliked each other. They've been fighting over something much bigger. Control. Dana White believes the UFC is the story. Ariel Helwani believes the truth is the story, and that difference matters more than people realize. Dana has always hated outside voices. He built the UFC in an era where the promotion controlled everything. Access, narratives, stars, timing. If the UFC didn't want a story out there, it didn't exist. But Ariel Helwani represents something the UFC was never designed to deal with. A media figure who doesn't need them. He doesn't need UFC access. He doesn't need UFC approval. He doesn't need UFC protection. He has his own audience. And in today's media landscape, that's power. That's why this beef isn't just personal. It's structural. Because every time Dana dismisses Ariel, every time he says he doesn't care, he's revealing something important. Not confidence, but resistance. Resistance to a world where the UFC doesn't fully control the conversation anymore. And here's the part that should worry the UFC. Ariel keeps winning these moments. Not because he's right or wrong, but because fans are listening. Because the UFC's audience isn't just watching fights anymore. They're watching the people who talk about the fights. And once that happens, the power dynamic changes. That doesn't mean the UFC is weak. Far from it. The UFC is still the most powerful force in combat sports. But moments like Dana versus Helwani are signals. They show us where the tension is building. And when you zoom out, you start to see why the UFC's dominance suddenly looks less permanent than it used to. For the last decade, the UFC has looked like the most stable combat sports company in history. Boxing couldn't keep its stars. WWE was scripted. Bellator was Bellator. And the UFC built something nobody else could, a machine. They didn't sell fighters. They sold the brand, the octagon, the belt, the feeling that this was the highest level of violence the world could legally produce. And the genius part was that the UFC didn't need to make individual athletes bigger than the company, because unlike boxing, where one star can hold an entire division hostage, the UFC could swap out stars like parts in an engine. Ronda leaves, Conor arrives. Conor slows down, Khabib takes over, Khabib retires, Izzy rises, Izzy fades, Sean O'Malley gets pushed, and now it's Topuria. It's Pereira, it's Aspinall. The UFC's model is simple. The brand is the star. And that model made them incredibly rich. But it also created the first crack in the foundation. Because when you train your audience to care about the UFC more than the fighters, eventually they stop caring about the fights. They start caring about the spectacle. And spectacle is something that can disappear faster than people realize. And here's the problem. The UFC isn't losing because the product is bad. They're losing because the world around them is changing. And the UFC is still acting like it's 2016. Because the real war isn't happening inside the cage, it's happening on screens. The UFC's biggest competitor isn't boxing, it isn't Bellator, it isn't PFL, it's not even another sport. The UFC's biggest competitor is the internet itself. Because modern fans don't consume sports the way they used to. The old model was simple. Watch the build-up, watch the PPV, talk about it at work Monday. But now, fans want the fight content instantly, constantly, and free. And that's where the UFC has a problem, because the UFC is still built on a business model that depends on one thing: pay-per-view. The problem is that PPV is a tax on attention, and attention is the one thing you cannot tax forever. Every other industry learned this already. Music tried to resist streaming, they lost. Movies tried to resist streaming, they lost. TV tried to resist streaming, they lost. And sports is next. But the UFC is still trying to squeeze fans the way cable TV squeezed their parents. And that's where the numbers start to get uncomfortable. Because when you look at what actually drives cultural relevance today, it's not buys, it's not gate, it's not even ratings. It's momentum, it's clips, memes, creators, conversations. Dana White built the UFC into a monster. But there's something about Dana that fans have started to notice. He doesn't sound hungry anymore. And that's dangerous because hunger is the UFC's greatest weapon. Dana used to sound like a guy fighting the world. Now he sounds like a guy defending a throne. And when the guy at the top stops caring, that's when everyone else starts smelling blood. Because the UFC isn't just a fight company, it's a narrative company. And the narrative is shifting. If Dana White represents the UFC establishment, Ariel Helwani represents the new media era. And whether you love him or hate him, Ariel understands something the UFC has never fully respected. Fans don't just want fights. They want the story around the fights. They want drama. They want truth. They want behind-the-scenes power struggles. And Ariel has become one of the only people who can consistently hijack the UFC's narrative. That's not a small thing. Because in the attention economy, controlling the narrative is controlling the product. And then there's Eddie Hearn. Eddie isn't MMA, but he represents something far more dangerous to the UFC, a business model that adapts. Boxing, for all its flaws, is built around stars, around promotion, around spectacle. And Eddie understands how to sell fights like events, not cards, not fight nights, events. And if the UFC starts slipping culturally, guys like Eddie don't need to beat the UFC directly. They just need to be ready when the audience starts looking elsewhere. Because combat sports fans are loyal, until they aren't. So why 2026? Because 2026 isn't just a random year. It's the year the UFC will be forced to answer the question they've been dodging for years. Are they a premium PPV product? Or are they a modern entertainment company? Because media rights are the real championship belt now, not the heavyweight title. And when the UFC negotiates their next major deal, the entire sport could shift overnight. If they double down on the old model, they risk losing the next generation of fans entirely. But if they pivot too hard, they risk losing the mystique that made them special in the first place. And that is the UFC's dilemma. They're trapped between two worlds, and both worlds are hungry. The UFC didn't become dominant by being safe. They didn't become dominant by being corporate. They didn't become dominant by trying to sit at the same table as the NFL and NBA. The UFC became the UFC because it was counterculture. It felt like the sport you weren't supposed to watch. The UFC was the rebellious younger brother of mainstream sports, the league that didn't care what people thought, and that's what made it feel alive. But now the UFC wants to be accepted. They want to be polished. They want to be respectable. They want to be ESPN friendly. They want to be the NFL. And that's where the UFC is making the most dangerous mistake possible. Because the UFC's ability to punch up isn't a bug in the system, it's the feature. It's the entire reason the UFC is culturally relevant. Fans don't love the UFC because it's clean. Fans love the UFC because it's raw. Because it feels like chaos with rules. Because it feels like anything can happen. And the moment the UFC becomes just another corporate sports league, the moment they become something you watch the way you watch basketball, they lose what made them special. Because if Dana White's lack of interest persists, if the UFC keeps treating its fighters like replaceable parts, if they keep squeezing fans with PPV while the internet moves toward free access, then they're not just risking a decline in popularity, they're risking irrelevance. And the scariest part? There are plenty of people waiting in the wings. People who understand the new media landscape better than the UFC ever has. Ariel Helwani is already shaping the conversation. Eddie Hearn already knows how to sell fights globally. And the moment the UFC loses momentum, the moment fans stop feeling like the UFC is the center of the fight universe, the cleanup crew will arrive. And they won't need to beat the UFC. They'll just need to replace them. The UFC doesn't need to become the NFL. It doesn't need to be the NBA. It doesn't need to be a polished corporate machine with sponsors glued to every surface, because the UFC already has what those leagues don't. Edge, energy, rebellion. The UFC was built on punching up at the world, and that attitude is what turned it into a global phenomenon. But in 2026, the UFC is going to face its biggest test yet. Not inside the cage, but in the boardroom. And the numbers won't lie. Because if the UFC isn't careful, if they forget what made them dangerous, they won't fall off because of bad fights. They'll fall off because they stop being the UFC. And in combat sports, someone is always ready to take your spot. So the real question isn't whether the UFC can survive. It's whether they can stay hungry long enough to stay relevant. Because the moment the UFC stops punching up, someone else will start punching down.